It was just another ordinary day. I was on my way to meet my friend Jake for a quick chat, you know, the kind of meetup where we talk about life, sports, and the latest news. But as I stepped into his house, I had no idea that this would be more than just a casual gathering. Jake's mother, Allison, was sitting in the living room as usual. I had known her for years. She was always warm, kind, and like a second mother to me. We often exchanged pleasantries, but there was never anything particularly special about our interactions. I didn't think much of it when I saw her that day, but something felt different. Maybe it was the way she smiled at me, or the fact that she was sitting there alone, which was unusual since Jake's dad was usually around. I shrugged it off and greeted Allison as I walked past. She looked up from the book she was reading and gave me a warm smile. "Hello, Adam. How's everything going?" she asked. "Busy as usual, same old," I replied, taking a seat. There was something about the way she spoke to me that felt different, like she was paying more attention than usual. But at that moment, I didn't think too much of it. After all, I was used to her friendliness. "Where's Jake's mom?" I asked, noticing how much quieter the house was than usual. "She's out running errands." "It's just me today," Allison replied with a shrug. "Would you like something to drink?" I accepted, and as she went into the kitchen, I took a moment to think. For some reason, my mind kept drifting back to her smile, the warmth in her voice, the way she looked at me when she asked about my day. It wasn't strange in itself, but something about it made me feel different. I wasn't sure what it was. When she returned with a drink, she handed it to me with that same smile. I thanked her and took a sip, my mind still wandering about what was happening. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this encounter than I wanted to admit. "Do you ever think about what your future will be like, Adam?" she suddenly asked. I was caught off guard. That wasn't a conversation we had ever had before. I don't know. I guess so. I mean, I try to think ahead, but sometimes it's hard to plan," I replied. She nodded thoughtfully and sat down across from me. "Yeah, it can be difficult," she said. "I remember when I was your age, everything seemed so clear, yet so uncertain at the same time. You don't always know what's coming next." There was something in her voice that made me pause. She wasn't just talking about the future in a general sense, she was speaking from somewhere deeper. Her words felt personal, like she was sharing something vulnerable. "I get that," I responded, my curiosity growing. "So how did you figure it out? How did you know what to do?" She looked at me for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. Finally, she smiled again, but this time, there was something deeper in her eyes. "Sometimes, you don't know until you live it," she said gently. "You just have to trust that things will fall into place when the time is right." I wasn't sure how to interpret her words, but something told me she wasn't just talking about life in general. There was something hidden behind those words, something I couldn't quite grasp. "Maybe you're right," I said, trying to push aside the strange feeling that was slowly creeping up on me. But the truth was, I wasn't entirely sure. I didn't know if this was just a random conversation or if something was changing between us in a way I wasn't ready to understand. When Jake walked into the room, breaking the moment, I realized I had no idea where this conversation was leading. But one thing was certain, something had shifted. It was a feeling I couldn't shake, and for some reason, I didn't want to. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure, this meeting would be different. And whatever happened next, I wasn't sure I could look at her the same way I had before. In the days that followed, everything felt like a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about my conversation with Allison. It wasn't that I had never talked to her before, but this time, it felt different. She wasn't just my friend's warm, caring mother anymore, there was something else, something I couldn't put into words. I found myself replaying her words over and over again, rewinding the way she looked at me when she talked about the future, the way her eyes lingered on mine a little longer than usual. It wasn't like I hadn't ever felt a little weird around her before. After all, she was my best friend's mom, and there had been moments where she playfully flirted in a harmless way. But it was always light-hearted, nothing that ever made me think twice. This time, though, it was different. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just one of those moments, just a random conversation that didn't mean anything. But every time I saw her again, I found it harder to ignore the shift I felt. The next time I saw her was a few days later at Jake's house, as usual. I walked in and saw her in the kitchen, making tea. "Hey, Allison," I said, trying to sound normal. But even I could hear the awkward tension in my voice, like there was an invisible boundary between us now, one that I wasn't sure how to cross. "Hey, Adam. How's everything?" she asked, smiling as she set the kettle down. "Good. Just been busy with work," I replied, trying to keep it casual. But I couldn't help but notice how beautiful she looked that day. Her hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and her simple blue blouse made her eyes stand out more than usual. It was hard not to notice. "Glad to hear that," she said, her voice soft and almost comforting. "How's Jake doing?" "He's good, you know. Just caught up in school and everything," I said, keeping the conversation light. We chatted for a while, but there was an unspoken tension in the air. It wasn't obvious, nothing you could point out, but there was a shift in our dynamic. I had to admit, I was drawn to her more than ever. And it wasn't just her appearance, it was the way she spoke, the way she made me feel when she smiled, like I was seeing a different side of her I had never noticed before. And that unsettled me. As we talked, I noticed how she seemed more open, sharing little details about her life that I had never heard before. She talked about passions, dreams, things she had done before settling down and raising Jake. I had always known her as a caring mother, but now, I was hearing about Allison, the woman behind the title. The woman who had once had hopes and desires of her own before becoming a mother. It was confusing. And I didn't know how to process it. Later, as the afternoon passed and I got ready to leave, Allison walked me to the door. We stood there for a moment, an awkward silence hanging between us. I could feel the weight of everything unsaid lingering in the air. "Take care, Adam," she said with a smile. But her eyes stayed on mine just a second longer than usual. "You too," I mumbled, feeling a tightness in my chest that I couldn't explain. As I walked to my car, I couldn't stop replaying that moment in my head. There was something there. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was there. It felt like a door had opened, one that couldn't be closed. A path I wasn't sure I should walk down. But I felt drawn to it anyway. The next few days were a chaotic mix of confusion and excitement. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, but I wasn't sure how to handle it. Every time I saw Allison, it was as if the world around us disappeared, leaving only the two of us. I kept finding excuses to visit Jake, even though I knew full well it wasn't him I was hoping to see. Until one night, when I unexpectedly showed up at Jake's house, everything finally reached a breaking point. I knocked on the door, expecting to see Jake lounging on the couch, but when the door opened, it was Allison who greeted me. "Oh, Adam, I wasn't expecting you tonight," she said, a surprised but welcoming smile on her face. "I just thought I'd stop by to check in," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Every word felt like an effort to conceal the growing tension between us. She stepped aside to let me in. The house was quiet, the gentle hum of the fridge was the only sound in the background as I walked into the living room. I was struck by the peace of the moment. There was a strange comfort in how natural everything felt between us, but I knew I couldn't ignore what had been building up. "I wasn't expecting you tonight, Adam. Jake's out with some friends," she said, sitting on the couch and patting the spot beside her. "You can stay if you'd like." Without thinking, I sat down next to her. The warmth of her presence was almost overwhelming, but at the same time, it felt right. The more time I spent around her, the more I realized I didn't want to fight whatever this was between us. "So, what's new?" she asked, casually, but I could see something flickering in her eyes, something unspoken. I swallowed hard. This was the moment. I had to say something, or I'd never be able to face her again without wondering what could have been. "I've been thinking a lot about the other night," I began, trying to keep my voice calm even as my heart pounded. She turned to look at me, her gaze steady but gentle. "What do you mean?" "You said some things," I continued, "and I haven't been able to stop thinking about them." "About you." The words were out now. There was no taking them back. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if I had just laid bare a part of myself that I had kept hidden for too long. For a moment, Allison said nothing. She just looked at me, her expression unreadable. Then, she spoke softly. "I don't know what you're trying to say, Adam," she said, her voice low, almost cautious. "But I need you to understand something. I am your friend's mother. I'm not some fantasy. I'm just me." I nodded, but inside, I felt a pang of frustration. I wasn't asking her to be anyone other than who she was. I wasn't expecting her to change or become someone she wasn't. But I needed to know if what I was feeling wasn't one-sided. "I'm not expecting anything, Allison," I said quickly. "I just need to know if you feel anything too." She was silent again, her eyes softening as she took a deep breath. For a second, I thought she might turn away, dismiss me as if this were just a fleeting thought. But then, her eyes met mine, and in them, I saw something I had never seen before: vulnerability. "I feel it too," she whispered. "But I don't know what to do about it." The words hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. It was as if time had stopped, trapping us in that moment, just the two of us, and everything unspoken between us. "I don't want to complicate things," Allison continued, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to ruin what we have, but I also can't ignore what's happening." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. We were both walking a fragile tightrope, caught between what we wanted and the reality of the situation. It wasn't something we could easily push aside, but it also wasn't something either of us knew how to navigate. "I don't want to ruin anything either," I said, my voice firm. "But I don't think I can stay away from you." She took a deep breath, and I could see the weight of the decision in her eyes. She was torn between the life she had built and the feelings growing between us. It was a delicate balance, one that could easily break if we weren't careful. "I don't know what this is, Adam," she said softly. "But I think we both deserve to find out." Her words gave me hope, but I also knew that nothing about this would be easy. This was going to be a journey neither of us could predict. But something inside me told me it was a journey I had to take. As the evening stretched on, the air between us shifted. We weren't at the end of this, but I could feel the connection growing stronger with each passing moment. For the first time, I believed that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a fleeting feeling, a passing moment. This was real. The uncertainty still lingered, hiding in the corners of my mind. But now, I felt like we were ready to face it together. The road ahead might be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. The next few days were filled with a strange anticipation. I found myself constantly thinking about Allison, every interaction, every glance, every word exchanged. The connection between us was undeniable, but there was still a cloud of uncertainty hanging over us. We were both hesitant, unsure of how to take the next step. I hadn't told Jake about our conversation. I didn't know how to explain what had happened, or even if I should. The idea of betraying his trust made my stomach twist, but I couldn't ignore the fact that something had changed. I wasn't sure what it was yet, but I could feel it deep inside me. Then, one afternoon, when I went over to Jake's house to hang out, things started to get even more complicated. He was in the backyard working on something in the garage, and Allison was inside, finishing up some chores. As I stepped through the front door, the familiar scent of fresh coffee greeted me. The house felt peaceful, quiet, and I had to admit, it was always comforting to be around Allison. But today, something felt different. A quiet tension seemed to hang in the air, almost like something unspoken was on the verge of bursting out. I saw her in the kitchen, humming softly as she worked. When she noticed me, her face softened into a warm smile. But there was a subtle change in her eyes, something that made my heart race. "Hey, Adam," she greeted me, trying to sound casual, but I could tell she was just as nervous as I was. Hey, I replied, my voice slightly higher than normal, betraying the anxiety I felt. How's everything? Same as always, she said with a shrug, but there was a slight tension in her words. And you? I've been thinking, I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. About us. About what we talked about. Her expression faltered for a fraction of a second before she quickly regained her composure. Adam, look. I don't know what this is, I cut in, speaking quickly. But I can't just pretend nothing is happening between us. She took a step back, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. I don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. I'm not trying to lead you on, Adam. I swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. I know. But I don't think I can walk away from this. She looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of the counter. The silence between us was thick, heavy with unsaid words, emotions neither of us knew how to handle. I've been scared too, she finally admitted. Her voice was barely louder than a fearful whisper about what it might mean, but I couldn't deny it anymore. I feel it too, Adam. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped closer. So what now? I asked, my voice rough with the vulnerability I had tried to hide. She turned fully to face me, her eyes meeting mine. I don't know, she said, her voice trembling. But I think we need to figure it out together. For a moment, I froze, unsure how to respond. What we were talking about wasn't simple. It wasn't easy. But it felt real. And that was something I couldn't walk away from. We stood there in silence for a while, both of us processing what had just been said. The air between us crackled with the unspoken understanding that something had changed, something deep and undeniable. Finally, Allison broke the silence. I think we should take it slow, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. We can't rush into this. We need to figure out what it means before we do anything. I nodded, understanding the weight of her words. I agree. I don't want to rush anything. But I also don't want to walk away. I know, she replied softly. I don't either. The tension between us slowly shifted into something else, something filled with mutual understanding. This wasn't going to be easy. There would be challenges ahead, especially with Jake in the picture. But for the first time, I felt like we were on the same page. We were ready to face whatever came next, together. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. I thought about how my feelings for Allison had grown. I never expected things to evolve this way. I had entered her life as Jake's friend, never considering her as anything more than that. But now, everything had changed. I didn't know where this would lead, but I knew one thing for certain, I wouldn't let fear or uncertainty dictate my choices. I was ready to figure this out with her, no matter what. The next morning, I woke up with a new sense of purpose. I didn't know how everything would play out, but I was willing to take the risk. I was ready for the journey ahead, even if it meant facing challenges and obstacles I could already see coming. As I got dressed and headed out to meet Jake for the day, I felt a clarity I had never felt before. No matter what happened with Allison, I would face it. And no matter how hard it got, I knew we would find a way, together. In the days following our conversation, an unspoken anticipation lingered between us. At first, Allison and I kept our distance, unsure of how to proceed. But the connection we shared had already shifted everything. We weren't just two people stuck in a complicated situation, we were two people who had felt something real, something undeniable. I spent more time with Jake than before, trying to act normal around him. But my thoughts kept drifting back to Allison. I couldn't help but wonder where this would go. Would it change everything between us? What would happen if Jake found out? But no matter how many questions filled my mind, one thing was clear, I couldn't ignore my feelings for her. And Al felt the same. We both knew we couldn't deny it anymore. It was time to make a choice. It was a Saturday afternoon when everything came to a head. I was supposed to meet Jake at a local cafe to catch up, just a casual hangout. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. As I walked into the cafe, I spotted Jake sitting in a booth near the back, his back to the door. He looked up as I approached, a grin spreading across his face. "Hey, man," he said, his voice light. "How's it going?" "Good. Just been thinking," I replied, my words more hesitant than I intended. Jake raised an eyebrow, noticing my tone. I hesitated. Was I ready to tell him? Was I ready to risk everything? I wasn't sure. But the guilt that had been eating at me finally became too much. "I need to talk to you about something," I said, my voice so low it was almost inaudible. Jake studied me carefully, his smile fading. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath and met his gaze. "It's about Allison." His expression flickered. "What about her?" I don't know how to say this, but I think I have feelings for her." The words tumbled out before I could stop them. A long silence followed. Jake just stared at me, processing what I had said. His face slowly paled, and his eyes narrowed, as if trying to decide whether I was joking or serious. "Wait," he said finally, his voice unsteady. "Are you telling me you have feelings for my mom?" I nodded, my heart pounding as the weight of my admission settled in. "I know it's complicated. But it's the truth. I can't deny it anymore." Jake just stared at me for a long moment, then slammed his hand against the table, his face filled with disbelief. "This is so messed up," he muttered. "How the hell did you let this happen?" "I didn't mean for it to happen," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It just did. But I swear, I never wanted to hurt you." The anger in Jake's eyes dimmed slightly, but it didn't disappear. "I don't know if I can even look at you the same way," he murmured, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, Jake. I never wanted this to come between us." The tension in the room was suffocating. Jake slowly pushed his chair back and stood. "I need time to think about this," he said, his voice distant. Without another word, he walked out of the cafe, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat there for a long time, staring at my half-empty coffee cup, unsure of what to do next. I had never imagined my friendship with Jake would come to this. I didn't want to hurt him. But I couldn't change how I felt. The truth was, I loved his mom. And now, I had to figure out how to deal with that. That night, I found myself standing at Allison's doorstep, unsure of how to approach her. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of fear and anticipation swirling inside me. I hadn't heard from her since our last conversation, and I didn't know if she still felt the same way. When the door opened, Allison stood there, her expression neutral, but her eyes holding something deeper, something I couldn't quite decipher. "Adam," she said softly. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge of uncertainty to it. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," I admitted, stepping inside. "I talked to Jake. He knows." Her face paled, and she looked away for a moment, processing the news. "How did he take it?" "Not well," I said. "He's angry." "I don't blame him." Allison moved toward the kitchen counter, gripping the edge tightly. "This is hard, Adam. I never wanted to hurt anyone. But what we feel, it's not something we can just ignore." I stepped closer, feeling the pull of her presence. "I don't want to hurt you either. But I can't deny what's happening between us." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with emotion. "I feel it too," she whispered. "But we have to be careful. Jake is my son. I never want to hurt him." "I understand," I said, my heart heavy with the weight of it all. "I just don't want to lose you." A long silence stretched between us before Allison took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Then let's figure this out. Together." We stood there, knowing the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But we also knew that, for better or worse, we had to face it together.